Hello, everyone. This is Tandem Coaching Academy's Keeping Agile Non-Denominational podcast. And today our guest is Marsha Acker, and she is executive team coach. She is a facilitator. She's a COVID survivor, a mom, and all that good stuff. And we are your hosts, Sheree Silas and I, Alex Goodenough. Hi, Marsha. Why don't you start with introducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah. So hi, Alex and Sheree. It's lovely to be here. So thanks. Um, Introducing myself. So I would say that I describe myself as an executive and team coach right now, but I come from a background of software engineering. So I often say like software engineering was my first career, working with engineers and end users to sort of bridge the gap between requirements and development. So I spent quite a bit of time in that space. Today, I coach executives and I work a lot with leadership teams. And I'm passionate about facilitation and coaching. So I've been doing this now for a number of years, and also have a great deal of passion around agile coaching and what that competency looks like. So that's I guess like a high level overview of
Fantastic.
me.
That
Yeah.
that high level gives us a lot to chew on. So we are going to build some bridges and bridge some
Mm,
gaps, right? With facilitation real conversations.
yeah.
So what is the role of real conversation in bridging those gaps?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. Alex, you picked up on a few minutes ago, like there's something today for me about talking about real conversations. And I think what sits behind that for me is I've had an opportunity to grow other facilitators, to certainly have my own multi-year journey in facilitation. I can look back on my own journey of when I would say early on in that process where I would be in front of a room holding space for a conversation, but I could point to moments where I made choices as a facilitator to like, oh, it feels like it's getting hot in here, or it feels like the conversation's getting a little bit heated, or there's some disagreement happening. And early on, I would make choices to like manage that out of the room. So it would look like a good time for a break, or let's go from full group conversation over to small groups. And so, I can laugh about it now and I can tell you about it now. I wouldn't have had the words and I think the framework and the structure to tell you, back then what I was doing. But I use as an example because I think there are many ways, either, playing in the role of facilitator or just simply being a team member in a conversation in a room, whether it's online or in a physical space, back when we used to do that, where I think we do sometimes a really good job at staying on the surface level. Like, what are the safe things to talk about? What are the things that, make it still feel like it's okay, or it's my role to offer this particular perspective, but it's not my role to say that, or this wouldn't be welcomed, or somebody might think that I don't like them, or that feels really difficult or rude. So I think we have lots of stories in our head about why we do what we do when we come to a conversation. And so for me, I think there's so much potential underneath the surface when you can get to the real conversation. And I don't think that's always easy. So I see facilitation as kind of bridging that gap.
Mhm. And as you're talking about that, what's coming up for me, kind of a parallel to the coaching world, is the coaching presence,
Mm,
being
mm-hmm.
in the moment, staying in the moment, and have all these opportunities and possibilities to go into all these multiple directions, and then picking one and making it important and
Yeah.
bringing value to the room and to the customer. So, how did you get where you are?
Mm,
How did you get to be this facilitator?
mm. I I love what you said just a moment ago about what you're hearing is coaching presence, because I would say the way I would describe that my model for facilitation, just my own personal model, is it's highly informed by coaching. So I think the skills and competencies of coaching and facilitation, blend really well. Where I started, so back in that first career, working with developers on a development team, that was back in '94, was when I was actually working with the Department of Defense, and we were trying to collect user requirements across all 5 services. So I was working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the objective was to, come to an agreement. If you've ever done any work with those 5 people, with those 5 organizations, getting those organizations to come to any kind of consensus on anything is rather challenging. So I found I was fresh out of college at that time, and I had a book called Joint Application Development. So this was well before we were talking about Agile, but it talked about facilitation. And so I found a class, went off to training for 5 days, and then stepped into the room the following week with 35 people and facilitated one of my first sessions around gathering requirements from end users. And that was really my first foray into facilitation. And I often say, like, that 5 days in that facilitation class changed fundamentally so much for me. So it changed how I looked at my own leadership. It changed how I interacted with friends. It changed how I interacted with, community work that I was doing. I just began to see, and at that point, I probably couldn't have told you that, but I began to see my own leadership as taking a very facilitative style. And so that was my first foray into it. And then I became quite passionate about it. So I started working in a development team. We were using extreme programming in '99, 2000. And that was where I really began to see this vision come to life for me about how things like facilitation could really bridge into this world of agility. It wasn't quite formed and didn't have its sort of formal momentum at that moment, but I saw some of the things that were coming out of extreme programming as a way, kind of a facilitative process. Like, we had cards on the table and we had developers gathered around talking about things. So it just really, there was aspects about agility that really spoke to the idea of collaboration. So fast forward a little bit, I came to the world of professional coaching. I guess it was around 2011 was when I first came into that space formally through training. So my own journey started very much in the world of facilitation for a number of years, and then coaching got woven into that as part of that second half of my journey so far.
And so I hear you talking about coaching and about facilitation. I'm wondering, what's the difference between coaching a team and doing facilitation?
So that's a question that I pondered for a number of years. So because I came from the world of facilitation, and then my coach training was through CTI, for the Coaches Training Institute. And after I completed that certification, I went off to ORSC. And mainly because I did a lot of work with teams, I wanted to do more of this team coaching thing. That I wanted to put more definition for myself around that. And I loved ORSC. ORSC informs still much of what I do today. There's so many of those principles that sit underneath what I do. And yet, sitting in the courses, one of the things that I was really confounded by or confused by was, what's the difference between facilitation and team coaching? Because in the coursework, for me, what I saw was facilitation. And so I came out of those courses, and probably for about 2.5 to 3 years, I sat with this kind of personal inquiry that I'd given myself around what is the difference between facilitation and team coaching. And I found that, some of my team coaching practice early on had in a way kind of blended and made a mess of both of those skills. So I'd walk in and be working with a team, and sometimes I would be coaching them and sometimes I would be facilitating. And I what I would say today, for me, the difference between the two, if I were to bottom line it, is just to say, I think team facilitation is when you're working with a team to produce an outcome. You know, they've got a retrospective that they want to do, or they've got a strategic plan that they're looking to create, and you're there to hold a process that gets them to that. And then I think there are moments, if you're also a trained coach and you're facilitating, you'll likely start to see dynamics in a team. You might be reading what's happening in the group, and then I think there's an intentional, conscious choice. And then have you designed to also coach a team, or did you design just to facilitate? I've got lessons learned on both of those accounts, but you know, what did you contract for, and what are you there to do, and what's the purpose of it? Because I think team coaching is much more about helping a group be able to see their own dynamics and work with the dynamics in the team, the interpersonal relationships, things that might sit under the surface, that there's the surface conversation and then there's the conversation underneath it. So I hold team coaching as much more about working with how the team works, and facilitation about helping a team reach that stated objective. And and for me, I think there's still some gray area in there, but drawing some distinctions.
Yeah. I hear you talking about facilitation in the context of like being in a session, being in a meeting. I'm wondering how you see the perspective of facilitating growth and learning over time, and how that facilitation and coaching blend together to do that.
You mean for a team over time? Like, yeah.
Team or an organization, a human.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, you know, if I think about the very basic view of, or how I think about facilitation, is it's holding that process lens and also being focused on a group, which is very much like it would be for a coach coaching somebody individually, or a coach coaching a team. And I do think that there's that process of, if you have the fortune of working with a team over a long period of time, and you're not, you know, getting your team for 6 months and then moving on to the next one, which I know some people, you know, end up in that particular situation. But I think if you're with a team, you know, long enough over time, there's a great gift in being able to watch a group, and then also help a group see, you know, how they're moving along that team development process, and where they've come from and where they're at and where they're headed to. I think teams, I don't think any of us really do a great job of sort of stopping to celebrate those moments of, hey, like, you know, 6 months ago we were here and now we're here. And, you know, even to have a facilitator that helps people just stop and take notice of that, I think can be helpful.
So something I picked on, and I absolutely love your definition of facilitation. And I know that we've been struggling with that. And I usually been talking about it as facilitator usually has an agenda to get a team somewhere, right? So, and you put it absolutely brilliantly, is that the goal of facilitation is to produce outcome, right? Whether in coaching, we do strive to produce outcome. However, it's up to the coachee to design the road, and our job is to be in a partnership, right?
Yeah.
So I want to pull on that and kind of bring it back to agile world. So we have this agile coach, and I have a feeling nobody knows what that is. So, and we say agile coach, great agile coach has to have all these skills and competencies and know all these things they need to do. So in your mind, for a holistic agile coach, how important facilitation competencies are?
I think that, well, one thing that's resonating for me about what you just said is, you know, who knows what an agile coach is. I think there's, my sense is that there's many different definitions of that, and I tend to not get myself caught up in exactly what that looks like. I do get caught up in people defining for themselves what it means for them. So I think that this process for everybody, you'll hear me refer to, well, in my model for facilitation or in my model for team coaching, I think that is some of the work to do for any of us. So for Agile coaches to be inspired or informed by all the things that they see, the definitions, but then to work to define, like, how does it, when they go to work with teams, what is the process that they use? Why do they do what they do? And to your question about facilitation, gosh, I think facilitation is just a fundamental leadership skill, at least in terms of the leadership that I think we take a stand for in agility of being able to foster collaboration in different ways. So I think it's a prominent skill for Agile coaches, for leaders, for executive coaches. I think that it really sits as a foundation of being able to take a look at a group and how do you help them make sense of where they are, what's happening in their conversation, where do they want to go? Do they still want to go to the same place that they said they wanted to an hour ago? So I think being able to take, sometimes that meta view of where are we at, and the path can look a little windy. So I think facilitation is kind of a core competency. I also think it's really overlooked. So if you've ever been part, so I'm sure both of you have, right? You've likely been part of like a really well done meeting. And then I think we've all been part of the meetings that we would like to exit sooner rather than later. And if you have that eye for facilitation, then you'll know likely what was happening that made that meeting that was really amazing go that way. But if you don't necessarily have that eye for facilitation, I think a lot of times people just think, oh, that was easy, or it just happened that way, or it was magic in some way. And yet, even like improv, yes, it happens organically, but there's some structure behind it. There's some principles that sit underneath of that. And so I think sometimes facilitation gets overlooked by a lot because it's in some ways it's not sexy. Even in Agile coaching, like there's no job that says Agile team facilitator, or very few. There's lots of jobs that say Agile coaching or Agile Scrum Master, enterprise coach, but you don't find a whole lot of job titles that refer to you as the Agile team facilitator. So I think in a lot of ways it's not sexy, it's not the thing that you want to live into, and yet I think it's really critical.
So it's interesting how you said that if you don't know what to look for, you will just see an awesome result. The team got something. They achieved that outcome. So what's coming up for me is that facilitation, great facilitation, is invisible and impactful.
I think so.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's your experience? Have you seen that, or have you had an experience of that?
I have observed a couple of great facilitators, and well, unfortunately, I know what to look for.
Yeah.
And I was like, that was amazing. I need to do that.
Yeah.
And from the standpoint of somebody who is just like, yeah, that's just a person who attends our meeting,
right.
They would be like, yeah, that meeting didn't suck.
Yeah.
Right.
When the facilitator's not good. And
yeah. Right. Like that's really easy to identify.
I want to pull back a little bit. Something that you said was very resonating with me, that facilitation is about leadership. And I don't want to bring kind of framework, but it comes back to like Scrum and Scrum Masters and the role of Scrum Masters in the Agile world, right? And kind of to cite Scrum Guide, which is apparently not a good thing these days, is that Scrum Master facilitate teams events when asked or when needed, right? And we talk a lot about Scrum Masters being the servant leaders, right? Which again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding there. So how do Scrum Masters start on this road, not only becoming facilitators, but also becoming leaders and bringing this leadership to their teams?
Mm. I think I guess I'd start answering that question by, how do you become a facilitator? And one is just finding, I think there's lots of paths to it, especially if the certification world isn't your thing. I think one of the best ways is to find somebody who you think does it really well and pair with them. I think co-facilitation is a great way to learn from somebody else and to do it kind of in the moment. So I think there's principles that you can learn about facilitation. I think looking at understanding some of the basic frameworks and how to look at your role, your process-oriented role with a group, and learning to let go of the content side of it, and beginning to remove yourself from that. And I think facilitation is a great step into that, what I would call leading from behind, where you do, which I think is another way at looking at servant leadership. I tend to not use that word a whole lot because I think it comes with a lot of baggage and it gets used for a lot of different things. But I do think it's really impactful when you've had the experience of being with a leader who you would say, who you might describe as a servant leader, but somebody who's able to both step forward and step back. And I think there's something about facilitation that teaches you some of those basic principles to maintain neutrality and hold the group's agenda and really be looking for the group's agenda and notice the difference between your agenda and the group's agenda. I have found a lot of times I will want something for a team, and I see that it's possible for them if they would only just see what I see. And in those moments where I can name, so now I'm holding my agenda and not theirs. And how do I help them see that so that they can make the choice about what they want to do next? And I think there's a lot about facilitation that really can create that pathway into experiencing, finding your own version of what is your version of servant leadership look like. What's your model for leadership and what's your model for facilitation, and how does that show up when you walk into a room and create space for others? So I think there's a lot to that. I've learned principles, have definitely understand some playbooks, but I think that it's some of the best facilitation that you'll learn will come from the bumps and bruises you get along the way.
As I hear you talk about facilitation, it sounds really like there's a coaching mindset, coaching approach that comes with that really makes it impactful.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the main competencies of coaching that make facilitation more powerful?
Yeah, that's a great question. Alex, I think you named it earlier, of presence, how to get connected to what's happening in the room, remove yourself from the equation. Powerful questions are invaluable. I think one of the things that powerful questions and the skills of listening that are present in the coaching world, and I think the coaching world does a really good job of teaching those skills, and porting them over into the facilitation world is, I think, invaluable. So the ability to turn down, your own stories in your own head and listen to what's happening, for someone else, but also to bring that curiosity and ask questions just like you would in a coaching conversation, but then applying it at a team level when you're facilitating. And to really begin to distinguish between your agenda versus the group's agenda, I think powerful questions really help you kind of shift that perspective. Talk about meta view in coaching of, being able to take a bigger perspective of what's happening. I think that serves really well in facilitation, because a lot of times as a facilitator, the group's here and they've said at the end of this meeting for the hour or the next 3 days, however long they're together, we want to get to this place where this is the outcome that we have. So always sort of holding that meta view, but then also being with the group as they wander along the path that brings them there. So I think, yeah, I think those are, I'm sure there's more that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but.
Yeah. And well, you mentioned your model of facilitation a few times, and I'm waiting for you to tell me, well, what is that model?
Well, you know, so well, here's what I would say about it. It's informed by a lot of my my learning lineage. So it started with a very process-focused facilitation that still sits at the core. The facilitation stance for me, so that's actually what I wrote the book about. The art and science of facilitation is about sort of those 5 guiding principles. So those principles sit very much underneath of that. I would say my approach to facilitation is highly informed by coaching, maybe even more so than some pure facilitation models. I think the two for me are very blended. And the other big piece, so ORSC certainly makes up a portion of it. Systems thinking and being able to see, you know, a system. And I think the other big part for me is structural dynamics. So that's the work of David Kenter, by being able to name like structural patterns that are emerging in a group and helping the group to see what's happening so that they can change the nature of the discourse that's happening in the conversation. So those are, I think, some of the big sort of theories that sit there. And then there's the, you know, what I would do in a room is often very much informed by some of those things. Yeah.
Okay. I like that. It's got my mind spinning. So,
I can see.
yeah, and I hear you talking about structural dynamics, and I don't know that everyone knows what that is. So would you give just like a quick, maybe little explanation or examples of what you might be seeing?
Yeah. So it's a theory of face-to-face communication. It comes from David Kenter. He has the Kenter Institute up in Boston, and I think what I like at the very fundamental part of it, what I'd say is it's a way of looking at the language that we use in conversation and being able to name the structure of it so that you can observe the patterns that are happening and then change the nature of the pattern. So if we all, you know, the structural dynamics talks about kind of 4 layers to communication. Actions are a bit easier to see in the room. Operating systems is the 2nd level, communication domains is the 3rd. And then what sits underneath all of it is childhood story. And so when all of our conversation, everything that we say could be coded into each of those levels sort of has a thing. So I could make a move in closed power and say, please stand up and, you know, put your pens down and move to the board. And I'm not asking for anybody's input. I'm giving a directive. I could also make a move in open system and say, you know, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? So what happens, like enough to get a sense of it, what happens in communication is that often when things are going well, we're in flow and we often have range, meaning we've got all parts of those structures active and being voiced in a conversation. When conversations get stuck or they become unproductive, or back to Alex, what you were asking about earlier, maybe the conversation becomes less real. I think that often there's some of those structures that are missing, meaning that some are overdone and some are not used at all. And I think what structural dynamics helps me do, at least, is it used to be that I would go, something is not going right in this room, but I can't put my fingers on it. Now I have a really accessible way of looking at it that takes actually the moral story out of it. So it's no longer about somebody's the naysayer or the devil's advocate or somebody's just being a pain, and gives me a language to put it in and then go, so here's what's happening and here's what's missing. And I think it's easily understandable for me, for the group. And that's ultimately what I want, is for the group to be able to own that and do something with it so that they're actually not reliant on always having a facilitator or a coach in their conversations. So it's a way of making the invisible more visible, so that you can get to those real conversations. You'll know it because the real conversations will often have a range, behavioral range in them.
And in a spirit of full transparency, my question, which I threw to Cherie, and that was a little bit of kind of, my question was around, so Sam Kainer was a Bible of facilitation for quite some time. And my question was like, well, what will I find in your book? And you were just answering that. I'm like, great job, Marsha. Great job answering the question that was not asked. And apparently there's a lot to learn upon really fantastic Kainer's book, right? And it sounds like what you wrote is really designed deeper for agile world and what you are observing there and how all these structures and all these frameworks can help agilists to be better at their communication. I want to pull back a little bit to coaching, right? And something you said really resonated, that one of the best way to start at facilitation, maybe to co-facilitate, maybe to work with somebody else, right? And in coaching, we know this practice, we know kind of the supervision practice, right?
Yeah.
Where you bring a qualified supervisor, and they can look at what you're doing and provide a kind of third party assessment, not assessment, but a view and on what's going on, right?
Yep.
So how does that resonate with maybe world of facilitation, or maybe kind of mix of your professional coaching skills and facilitation? What's your thought on that?
I think, there's a lot that there's a lot I could say, I think, about the world of supervision. It definitely, it comes out of coaching, and I think that even in the coaching world, it's informed by the therapy world, and those practices coming forward into the coaching space. I hold a viewpoint that I think supervision is so needed when we're in this space of working with other humans, because we too are human. And I don't think there's any point that any of us will get to where I think we get better. I guess I speak for myself. I'm definitely better at understanding my own behavior, my own self, and how I impact what I do in a room, and how that shows up. So I catch things sooner than I used to. But I don't think I'll ever get to the space where I can't get hooked by something, or potentially be playing a role, even if I'm working with a team or doing an extended amount of facilitation over time, where I might not get caught in some of the system traps, and then actually be contributing to it rather than helping it, for whatever reason. I think that happens for a lot of reasons. So I think this process of supervision, I would love to see make its way into the Agile space more. So whether it's for facilitation, whether it's in the individual coaching, Agile coaching practice, or Agile team coaching, I think there's so much to having it, and I think it's slightly different than having a co-facilitator, but it definitely comes from that same space of there's another voice next to you, that sometimes when you see certain things, somebody else will see something different, and to have somebody that's got a different model, that's got a different viewpoint of what's happening in the room, potentially has different language for it, and can say, hey, like, I think this is what's playing out here. Where might we be creating that, or where might we not be supporting what they really need? So I think that external perspective that can help you think about it in a different way is super helpful.
Yeah, I know that in the Americas, we're just starting to hear a little bit about supervision. Like, it's been big with our partners who are in European area. And in fact, that's where I first learned about it, from someone abroad. And you're right, it's fascinating, right? I can bring my work in a confidential position to another person, another coach, a peer, who can help me figure out what to do with that. And I agree. I think the Agile space really needs this, because we're fooling with people's lives. We're fooling with their organizations, right? And the work we do as Agile coaches in this organizational perspective is extremely complex. And so to be able to have someone to bring that to and say, hey, would you talk through this with me, and let's see what comes up. So I agree there. And I'm wondering, how do you see supervision actually being brought into the Agile space?
That's a good question.
One of them trying to answer.
Yeah. I don't know. If you've got ideas, I would love to hear them. If I'm honest, I worry a little bit about it, because I think that there's a lot of things that I watch in the Agile coaching space, and I don't think that they're bad or wrong. So that's not what I'm about to say. But there's lots of places, the meetups that happen, coaching circles where you can go practice coaching and practice with a colleague or a peer. And I think those are beautiful. Like, I don't want anybody to ever stop them. And I guess that, to your question, I think one of the reasons that resonates is because it's low cost, low entry. It's not something that I have to pay for as an Agile coach, in addition to, everything else that I'm paying for. And I know there's often some price sensitivity around, getting support and help. And I guess if I think about supervision, much like I think about individual coaching, I think it comes with a fee. And there aren't a whole lot of I'm not sure there's a whole lot of supervisors even in the professional coaching world. And then I know you all are doing supervision with where you are. And so I think yay. I'm really excited about that. But I think it takes skill, and it takes, I think, the development of that kind of muscle and practice, and knowing how to bring it and apply it. And so I guess if I had to articulate a vision, my hope would be that it's accessible to a lot of people, and that it's also not necessarily, I think it's one of those places where the entry to be able to do it, maybe low point of entry isn't necessarily the best thing in that regard. So yeah, I would love, I'm a big fan of rigor and putting things in place that have some definition to them, and also create containers where, there's some real thought and ethics and rigor that sit around it. But I also think there's so much impact that it could have. It's exactly what you say, Sherry. It's like we're working in lots of complexity, and I think it's easy to get lost and caught up in it.
And I think all of these career paths, these disciplines, right? You've got facilitation, you've got coaching, you've got supervision, and done well by people who are skilled and educated, they look like anybody can do this, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just walk in and do it.
Right.
But the reality is, what makes it look so simple is the education and experience and competency. And that's what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting, Marsha, as you've been talking about fees, and I know conversation about money is uncomfortable. And as much as we are in this to change the world and all that, we're also to make money, right? And I think we need to be comfortable with this conversation. However, as you've been talking about that, one word just kept popping up for me is it's quality. It's competence, it's quality. And that's expensive, right? Something to be said about the entry barriers. And I fully agree with you. It's probably like, if as agile coaches we touch people's lives, supervisors touch people lives who touch people lives. So
Yeah.
their impact,
It's a multiplication.
it's multiplied. So
Yeah.
with low quality, with people not particularly having the right competencies, that's
Yeah.
probably not the right place for that.
Yeah. Alex, you made the comment like it's quality and it's expensive, and I would add, and it's worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The multiplied growth can go the other way, and you can have the multiplied damage.
Yep.
And that's what we want to prevent.
Yep. Absolutely.
So, Marsha, pulling back, the book. Well, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Feels like everybody is writing the books these days, and it never stops amazing me how dedicated and how hardworking those people have to be actually get it done. So first of all, congratulations on having that. And I'm definitely looking forward to reading that. So what's next for you? Book is done. I know that you are on a speaking tour, promoting and getting the word out. What's next in Marsha's world?
I don't quite know. There's lots of things that will continue that are already in flight, but I think that this question around what's next, I've been pondering quite a bit, and I don't quite have definition to it. There's another book coming. So the way that this book got created, which has been in the works for years, I think it started out with a scope of this, and I was working with an editor a couple of years ago, and she said, you know what, I think that you've got actually 3 books instead of just one. And she's like, what if you did this, this, and this, and chunked it up in that way? And it was a phenomenal suggestion, and that's what got this book out the door now. So there's 2 others that are sort of sitting there, and I'm trying to decide, when and how will that look. And they're not done by any means, but there's sort of the sketch outline is there. Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure. I think the other thing that 2020 for me was a moment to step back and ponder. I think when big change happens, so I can remember several moments in my life where I would say I felt like, the rug was ripped out from underneath of me and something, really different emerged. 2020 was definitely one of those places where I look at those now, whereas I used to, bite my nails and go, oh my goodness. I look at those things that happen now and I go, what's the opportunity here, and what does this create space to do differently or think differently? So I've really been in that space the last couple of months of how could we shape and shift and change and rethink some of the principles that we've been talking about today. I think really are there. So my focus will sort of continue to be about how do we grow sort of this collective leadership range, and what does that look like, and lots of ways to go about that. So something in that space.
And it's obvious to me there's so much to learn from you and what you are doing. So those our listeners who want to learn more, how do they get in touch? Where do they reach out? What do they do?
Well, if you want to learn about the book, it's you can go to the Art and Science of Facilitation.com. You can actually download the first chapter for free. So that's up there. And there's a self-assessment that you can take around facilitation skills. So that's one place to get started. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Marsha Acker, and then we teach workshops around facilitation and coaching at Team Catapult. So any of those will get you in the right direction.
Fantastic. Well, Marsha, thank you so much for spending this time today with us. It was fascinating to learn more about the world of facilitation and how it interconnects and interweaves with all the professional skills that we are working hard to bring into Agile world. So thank you so much. And
thank you for having me.
And it's been Tandem Coaching Academy's Keeping Agile Non-Denominational podcast. And we were your hosts, Shuri Silas, and I, Alex Goodenough. Bye now.